Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the pages of time. There are stories that cross centuries and yet pulse as if they were written yesterday. They are narratives that speak of something eternal within us, the desire to be seen, to be loved, not for what we possess but for who we truly are. The story you are about to hear is one of those rare jewels that time has preserved, a tale of wounded pride and silent dignity, of a man who had everything and owned nothing, and of a woman who had nothing, yet carried the entire wealth of the world within her. Before we begin, I would like to know, where are you listening to me from right now? From which city, which corner of this vast world are you connecting to this story? Leave a note in the comments. I love knowing where those who share my love for good narratives come from. And if this is your first time here, or if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the perfect moment. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single story. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing narratives that touch the soul. Now, settle in, take a deep breath, and allow yourself to be transported to another time. Part 1, The Return and the Condition. Year 1846 to 1847. Location, Montferrat County, Tuscany region, Italy. In the rolling hills of Tuscany, where vineyards stretch like mantles of green velvet over the ochre earth, stands Castello Frescobaldi, an ancient stone fortress that guards the secrets of generations. Below it, nestled among centuries-old olive trees, the small village of Santa Margherita wakes with the crowing of roosters and sleeps with the scent of ripe grapes. It is here, in this setting of contrasts between opulence and simplicity, between cold marble and warm earth, that our story unfolds. A story of two worlds that should never have met, and that, upon meeting, discovered they might have been all along two sides of the same coin. September 1846. The carriage wheels creaked over the stone path, as if protesting every metre travelled. Inside the closed vehicle, where crimson velvet curtains blocked the golden light of the Tuscan autumn, Count Cosimo Frescobaldi kept his eyes fixed on an invisible point, somewhere between the nothing and the emptiness that had inhabited his chest for years. 7 years. 7 long years since he had last seen those hills, those vineyards that stretched as far as the eye could see, that castle that rose on the horizon like a sleeping giant. 7 years since he had fled, for there was no other name for what he had done, from the responsibilities, the expectations, the perpetual look of disapproval from his father. And now he was returning, not by choice, not out of longing, not for redemption. He was returning because the Marquis Leopoldo Frescobaldi had finally surrendered to what all men, noble or otherwise, eventually surrender to: mortality. The carriage passed through the castle's wrought iron gates, and Cosimo felt his jaw muscles clench involuntarily. The rose bushes his mother had planted by the wall were dead, only twisted branches and dry thorns, like skeletal fingers pointing to the grey sky. No one had bothered to care for them. No one had cared. The butler, a grey-haired man named Bernardo, waited on the stone steps with the same impassive expression Cosimo remembered from his childhood. The servants formed a silent line behind him, heads bowed, hands clasped, the posture of those who had long learned that to serve meant to be invisible. Cosimo stepped down from the carriage without waiting for assistance. His Italian leather shoes touched the courtyard stones, and for a fleeting instant he felt again like the 10-year-old boy who had run across that same courtyard, crying, the day his mother was taken by fever. He pushed the memory away, like swatting an annoying fly. "Lord Count," Bernardo's voice was neutral as still water. "The funeral was held 3 days ago. You arrived too late." There was no accusation in those words, only the statement of a fact, and perhaps that was what made them even more cutting. "I know." Cosimo offered no explanations. There were no explanations to offer. The letter had arrived late. Business in Rome demanded his attention. The roads were bad after the September rains. Excuses. All of them. Mere excuses. The castle's interior smelled of consumed candle wax and silence. Cosimo crossed the great hall, where portraits of ancestors watched him from the walls with painted eyes that seemed to judge his every step. His mother's portrait, young, beautiful, with that smile he had inherited but rarely used, occupied a prominent place above the unlit fireplace. Beside it, newly installed, was the portrait of his father. The artist had captured with disturbing accuracy that gaze Cosimo knew so well, hard, piercing, eternally dissatisfied. "The family lawyer awaits you in the study, sir." Bernardo appeared behind him like a shadow. "There are urgent matters to discuss." The Marquis's study remained exactly as Cosimo remembered, walls lined with books no one read, a massive dark oak desk, the scent of tobacco and old leather impregnated in the heavy curtains. The lawyer, a thin man named Signor Bianchi, rose from his chair upon seeing him enter, holding a bundle of papers as if they were sacred relics. "Count Frescobaldi!" The lawyer offered a short bow. "My condolences on the loss of your father." The Marquess was a memorable man. Cosimo almost smiled at the euphemism. Memorable. Yes, his father was many things. Tyrant, cruel, obsessed with family honor, incapable of showing affection, and certainly memorable. The will. Cosimo sat in his father's chair, feeling the leather give beneath his weight. "I presume I am the sole heir." Signor Bianchi cleared his throat. There was something in his eyes, nervousness, anticipation, that made Cosimo frown. "You are indeed the sole direct heir, Count. However," the lawyer opened the bundle of papers, adjusting his spectacles on his pointed nose. "Your father established conditions." "Conditions? For you to inherit the title, the lands, the vineyards, and the Frescobaldi family fortune, you must be married within 9 months from the date of your arrival at the castle. The wife must reside here as countess during that period." The silence that followed was so dense, Cosimo could hear the crackling of the candles on the desk. For a moment, he thought he had misunderstood. Married? His father, who had never shown interest in his personal life, who had never asked if he was happy, who had never even mentioned the possibility of grandchildren, that same father was now forcing him to marry, to inherit what was his by right of blood. "And if I do not meet this condition?" Cosimo's voice came out more hoarse than he intended. "Everything, absolutely everything will be donated to the church. The castle will become a monastery. The lands will be divided among the local parishes. The Frescobaldi name will be extinguished." Cosimo closed his eyes. He could feel, even from beyond the grave, his father's hand squeezing his throat. The old man had found a way to control him, even from the grave. A final lesson, a final test, a final humiliation. "There is something else." Signor Bianchi hesitated, then extended an envelope sealed with the family signet. "A personal letter. The Marquess requested it be delivered only to you by hand." Cosimo took the envelope as if it were a serpent about to strike. The red wax seal bore the coat of arms he wore on his own ring, the eagle and the grapevine, symbols of power and prosperity that now seemed to mock him. He waited for the lawyer to leave before opening the letter. His father's handwriting was unmistakable, angular, firm letters, without any unnecessary flourish. "Cosimo, if you are reading this, it is because I have finally decided to spare you my presence. Do not expect words of affection. I have none, and it would be hypocrisy to feign them at the last moment. You fled your roots. You fled me, the name, the responsibilities given to you before you were even born. You spent years wasting in the drawing rooms of Rome what generations built with sweat and blood. But I know you better than you know yourself, my son. There is something in you that can still be saved, not by me, for I failed at that task, but perhaps by someone who sees beyond your masks. Find that person. Marry not for convenience or appearance, but find someone who is capable of challenging you, of making you question everything you think you are. Someone who will not bow to your title or your money. Find your roots in another person, or lose everything you never deserved. Your father, Leopoldo Frescobaldi P.S. Your mother would have been kinder in these lines. I was never her. Cosimo read the letter 3 times. By the third, his hands were trembling, with rage, with confusion, with something he refused to name. Outside the window, the autumn wind tore the last leaves from the grapevines, and somewhere deep within the castle, an ancient clock chimed the hour, marking the start of a countdown that would forever change the destiny of all involved. 9 months, 270 days to find a wife, to save a legacy, to prove to a man who could no longer hear that he, Cosimo Frescobaldi, was more than his failures. But where in God's name would he find a woman willing to marry a man everyone called a Stoneheart? October 1846. The first rains of October turned the dirt paths into rivers of mud, and Castello Frescobaldi seemed to shrink under the weight of the grey clouds that covered Tuscany. Cosimo spent his days locked in his father's study, drafting letters with a handwriting that betrayed his growing anxiety, letters that leaned too far to the right, blurred by haste. He wrote to the Countess Visconti of Milan, whose marriageable daughter was known for her beauty and generous dowry. The response arrived in a week, a polite, almost cold note declining the proposal with the excuse that the young woman was already promised to another. He wrote to the Baron Medici of Siena, offering not only his hand but also a substantial sum to seal a union with his niece. The letter was returned unopened, the seal intact, like a silent slap. He wrote to the widow Contarini of Venice, a woman in her 40s who rumors claimed was seeking a second husband to restore her social standing. He didn't even receive a reply. In the second week of October, when the fourth refusal arrived, this time from the Strozzi family, who returned the letter with a dry note, informing him that their daughter deserved someone with a better reputation, Cosimo hurled the paper into the fireplace and watched the flames devour the words he hadn't even had a chance to utter. His reputation preceded him, the cold-hearted count, the son who abandoned his father, the heir who preferred the brothels of Rome to the vineyards of his homeland. The rumors spread through the noble houses of Tuscany like wine spilled on a white cloth, staining everything they touched. That night, unable to sleep, Cosimo went down to the kitchens in search of something strong to drink. The castle was asleep, but the embers still glowed in the great fireplace where the servants would prepare bread in the morning. It was there he heard the voices, whispers they thought were safe from noble ears. "They say he's already received 4 refusals. It was the voice of one of the maids, barely stifling a laugh. The proud Count Frescobaldi, rejected like any common suitor. And he still has months until the deadline. Another voice, masculine this time, perhaps one of the gardeners. "I bet 2 florins he loses everything. I bet 3. No woman of worth would marry a man like that." They say even his own mother didn't love him. Cosimo retreated into the shadows, his blood pounding in his temples. The last sentence hit him like hot iron. His mother, his sweet mother with the brown eyes who sang him to sleep, who taught him to read, who died whispering his name as the fever consumed her fragile body. How dare they speak of her? How dare they use her memory to hurt him? He climbed the stairs in silence, each step a battle against the urge to go back and confront those insolent servants. But what would he say? That they were wrong, that he was, in fact, worthy of love. For the first time in many years, Cosimo looked at himself without the masks he had so carefully cultivated, and he did not like what he saw. The next morning, he summoned Bernardo to the study. The butler entered with his usual composure, but there was something in his eyes, something that might be pity or perhaps just the exhaustion of decades serving men who thought themselves better than they were. "The servants speak of me." It wasn't a question. "They are betting I will lose the inheritance." Bernardo did not deny it. He did not confirm it. He simply waited, like a stone waiting for the storm to pass. "How much are they betting?" "A few florins, sir." "Nothing significant." "And you, Bernardo, what do you think will happen?" For a long moment the butler remained silent. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of long-kept truths. "I think you are more than you think you are, Count, but I also think you have never bothered to find out what." Cosimo dismissed him with a nod, but the words remained, like thorns under the skin, impossible to ignore. That afternoon, he made a decision. If no noble family wanted him, if his reputation was so stained that even his money was not enough to clean it, then he would marry whoever would accept. A merchant's daughter, a craftswoman, a peasant, if necessary. He would marry even if it was a beggar. The humiliation, he decided, would be bearable. Losing everything would not be. And so as the October sun began to give way to twilight, and the first stars appeared over the hills of Tuscany, Count Cosimo Frescobaldi saddled his horse and set out to explore the lands he had inherited, lands that, in 31 years of life, he had never bothered to traverse. He did not know, as he rode the dirt paths between the sleeping vineyards, that fate was already weaving the threads of an encounter that would change everything. He did not know that, at some hidden spring among the hills, a young woman with amber eyes was washing clothes while reading a forbidden book. He did not know that the answer to his father's conditions lay not in the noble halls that rejected him, but in the proud heart of a peasant woman who would never bow before anyone. But he was about to find out. Part 2. Agnese, November 1846. The path meandered between ancient olive trees whose twisted trunks seemed to guard secrets of centuries. Cosimo rode without a fixed destination, letting his horse choose the direction, lost in thoughts that spun in circles like leaves in the wind. The air smelled moist with earth after the rain, mingled with the scent of the last wild flowers of autumn. It was then that he heard water. A crystalline sound like distant bells guided him through a chestnut grove to a clearing where an ancient spring flowed from the rocks. The structure was clearly Roman, a remnant of an empire that had dominated those lands long before any Frescobaldi set foot there, with moss-covered stones and a semicircular basin where the water collected before continuing its path downhill. But it was not the spring that made Cosimo pull the reins and stop his horse among the shadows of the trees. A young woman was kneeling by the water, the sleeves of her simple linen dress rolled up to her elbows, as she washed clothes with rhythmic, precise movements. Her hair, a deep brown that caught the sun's rays as if it were honey, was tied back in a braid that fell over one shoulder, and in her lap, propped against a stone to keep it dry, rested a book. Cosimo frowned. A peasant reading? He approached a little closer, trying to see the title on the worn spine. When he finally succeeded, his astonishment was genuine. The Divine Comedy. Dante Alighieri. The young woman read between one piece of laundry and the next, her lips moving silently as her eyes scanned the lines. There was something in her face, a fierce concentration, a silent dignity, that made him stay there watching her as one watches a rare painting in an unexpected museum. Perhaps a branch snapped beneath the horse's hooves. Perhaps she simply felt the weight of eyes upon her. The fact is, suddenly, the young woman lifted her head and looked directly at the spot where Cosimo was hiding. Her eyes were the color of amber, golden in the sunlight, with darker streaks that seemed to hold storms, and in them there was no fear, no submission, not even surprise, only an unshakable calm, like the surface of a deep lake. She did not stand up. She did not bow. She did not lower her gaze, as all peasant women were taught to do before their lords. She simply closed the book carefully, shielding it from the moisture, and spoke with a voice clear as the spring water. "Are you lost, sir?" The question was simple, but the tone carried something more. A veiled challenge, perhaps, or merely the observation that a man in fine clothes mounted on a pedigree horse clearly did not belong in that place. Cosimo guided the horse out of the shadows, emerging into the daylight like one accepting a silent duel. The young woman did not move a muscle, not even when he dismounted and walked to the edge of the spring. "Do you know these lands?" he asked, ignoring her question. "I was born in them." There was pride in those 3 words, the kind of pride that does not depend on titles or riches. "You are the new count." It was not a question. Cosimo realized she already knew who he was, probably had known since the moment she saw him among the trees, and yet she showed no deference. "And you are someone who needs to finish washing these clothes before the sun sets." She resumed her work, her hands plunging into the cold water, with the familiarity of one who has repeated the gesture for years. "The way back to the castle is over there." She pointed with her chin to a path on the right. "Follow it to the split oak and turn left. You can't miss it." Cosimo remained standing, unsure exactly what to do with this woman, who treated him as if he were a random traveler asking for directions, and not the lord of all these lands. "Dante," he indicated the book with a gesture of his chin. "That is an unusual choice for a washerwoman." The amber eyes lifted again, and this time there was something that might be contained anger, or perhaps just impatience. "Knowledge does not ask the profession of those who seek it, Lord Count, and the words of Dante belong as much to me as they do to you." She returned to her washing, clearly ending the conversation. And Cosimo, for the first time in his adult life, found himself speechless before a woman. He mounted his horse in silence. Before leaving, however, he looked one last time at the figure kneeling by the spring, that strange young woman who read Dante, who would not bow, who had the hands of a worker and the eyes of a queen. "What is your name?" The question escaped before he could contain it. The young woman did not raise her eyes this time. "Agnese." The voice was soft but firm. "Agnese Moretti." Cosimo etched the name into his memory like one holding a map of unexplored lands. Then, without another word, he turned his horse and followed the indicated path. Only when he was far enough that she could not see him did he allow himself to look back. The clearing was out of sight, hidden by the trees, but he could swear he still heard the sound of rushing water, and beneath it, almost inaudible, the murmur of ancient verses whispered by a peasant's lips. Something had shifted that afternoon by the Roman spring. Cosimo did not yet know what to name it, but as he rode back to the castle under the orange twilight sky of Tuscany, he felt for the first time in a long time that perhaps there was something on those lands beyond obligation and inheritance. Perhaps there was a mystery to unravel, and its name was Agnese Moretti. November 1846. Later. 3 days passed since the encounter at the spring, 3 days during which Cosimo caught himself thinking about the young woman with the amber eyes, with a frequency that deeply annoyed him. He ordered Bernardo to investigate, discreetly, as if the information were merely a passing curiosity and not a growing obsession. The reports came in little by little, like pieces of a puzzle he hadn't asked to assemble. Agnese Moretti, 24 years old, daughter of Beppe Moretti, once the region's most respected master vintner, now blind due to an accident in the vats 5 years ago. Her mother had died giving birth to the youngest daughter, Giulia, who was now 16 and helped her sister with household chores. They lived in a modest cottage in the village of Santa Margherita, surviving on what Agnese earned washing clothes and sewing for other families, and there was more. Agnese could read and write, taught in secret by Father Anselmo, the old village vicar who believed knowledge was everyone's right, not the privilege of a few. She guarded borrowed books like treasures, reading them by the light of spent candles late into the night. A literate peasant, a woman who cared for her blind father and young sister, a person who, even in poverty, held her spine straight and her gaze high. Cosimo told himself it was just curiosity, that any man would be intrigued by such an anomaly, that his visit to the Moretti home was simply to better acquaint himself with his tenants, nothing more. But when he mounted his horse that November morning, his heart beat faster than he cared to admit. The house was smaller than he had imagined, walls of stone worn by time, a reddish tiled roof where moss grew in the corners, a wooden door that had once been painted blue, but now showed more splinters than color. In the small yard, a few chickens pecked among rosemary bushes, and a clothesline displayed mended clothes drying in the wind. Cosimo dismounted and knocked on the door without hesitation. When it opened, it wasn't Agnese who appeared, but a girl with curious eyes and disheveled hair, Giulia, certainly. "I have come to speak with Agnese Moretti." The girl measured him from head to toe with a boldness that bordered on impertinence. Then, without a word, she disappeared into the house. Cosimo heard whispered voices, a muffled protest, and finally, approaching footsteps. Agnese appeared at the door like one bracing for a storm, head held high, shoulders tense, amber eyes flashing with something he couldn't quite identify. She wore the same kind of simple clothes as their encounter at the spring, but her hair was loose now, falling in waves over her shoulders, and there was flour on her hands. She had interrupted a task to receive him. "Lord Count." Her voice was controlled, but he detected ice beneath the surface. "To what do I owe the honor? May I come in?" "Why?" The question caught him off guard. He was accustomed to doors opening, to faces smiling subserviently, to permissions granted before they were even requested. This woman looked at him as if he were a peddler offering goods of questionable quality. "I have a business proposition." Something flickered in her eyes. Distrust, curiosity, but she stepped aside to let him enter. The interior of the house was humble, but clean. Furniture worn by use, simple fabric curtains on the windows, a smell of baking bread that emanated from a clay oven in the corner. And seated in a chair by the window, hands resting on a wooden cane, was a white-haired man whose opaque eyes stared into the void. Beppe Moretti, the blind father. Cosimo crossed the room without greeting him. He was focused on Agnese, on the proposal he had mentally rehearsed throughout the ride. He did not notice the stiffening of her shoulders, nor the way her hands clenched into fists. 8,000 lire, he said, taking a wad of notes from his pocket and placing it on the rough wooden table. And land. 20 hectares of vineyards on the north slope, plus the stone house on the edge of the property. All of this in exchange for a marriage. The silence that followed was dense as winter fog. "A marriage of appearances," he continued, interpreting the silence as interest. 2 years only. You will be my wife legally. You will live at the castle as countess. You will have access to all the comforts money can buy. After the 2 years, we separate discreetly. You keep the money and the land, and we both go our separate ways." Agnese did not move. Her face was an impenetrable mask, but Cosimo could see the accelerated pulse in her neck, the slight tremor in her compressed lips. "Why me?" "Because I need a wife to fulfill the conditions of my father's will. And you," he allowed himself a half-smile, "are clearly different from the other women in this region." It was then that it happened. Agnese picked up the mug of water that was on the table, cold water she had used to wash her hands minutes earlier, and threw it directly into Cosimo's face. The shock was so great that he stumbled back 2 steps, water dripping from his fine clothes, splattering on the dirt floor. The clay mug fell and shattered into pieces at his feet. "Are you insane?" The words came out strangled, more from surprise than from anger. Agnese stood before him now, her amber eyes burning like embers, her voice trembling but firm. "You walked into my house." Every word was a stone thrown. "You passed my father as if he were a piece of furniture. You did not even greet him, you did not even acknowledge his presence. And then you had the audacity to offer me money as if I were a commodity for sale." Cosimo looked at the blind old man by the window. The man remained motionless, but there was something in his expression, a wounded dignity perhaps, or the resignation of one who has suffered too many humiliations. Get out." Agnese's voice cut him off. "Get out of my house, Lord Count, and if you ever wish to return, first learn to be a man worthy of crossing this threshold." Cosimo left. There was nothing more to say, nothing to do. He mounted his horse in silence, his clothes still soaked, his face burning, not from the water, but from the shame. And as he rode back to the castle under the cloudy November sky, an uncomfortable truth began to form in his mind. That woman, with her simple clothes and calloused hands, possessed something that he, with all his money and titles, had never had: dignity. And for the first time in his life, Cosimo Frescobaldi wished to be worthy of something beyond his name. December 1846. December arrived, bringing the cutting cold of the mountains and a light snow that covered the hills of Tuscany like a bridal veil. Castello Frescobaldi prepared for the end-of-year festivities, a tradition the butler insisted on maintaining, even without a lord who cared about celebrations. Cosimo had spent 2 weeks in silence. He had not returned to the village of Santa Margherita, had not sent messengers, had not made new proposals, but neither could he stop thinking about the scene that had unfolded in that humble kitchen. Agnese's face, the cold water, the shame that still burned in his gut like a poorly extinguished ember. And more than anything, he could not forget the blind old man by the window, the man he had treated as invisible, the father Agnese loved enough to defend fiercely. His own father had never inspired such devotion. On the eve of St. Nicholas, Cosimo woke before dawn. He dressed in simple clothes, no velvet or silk, just thick wool and worn leather, and rode to Santa Margherita while the village still slept under its blanket of snow. The Moretti house seemed even more fragile in the winter cold. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating someone was already awake, tending the fire against the chill of the early morning. Cosimo dismounted, took off his hat, and knocked on the door. It was Julia who opened it again, her eyes wide with surprise at recognizing him. But before she could say anything, Cosimo spoke, and his voice, this time, carried something different. "Good morning, Signorina Julia. Forgive me for coming so early. I would like to speak with your sister, if possible." And he hesitated, as if the words were hard stones to swallow. "I would like to pay my respects to Signor Beppe Moretti." The girl stood still for a moment, clearly torn between distrust and curiosity. Then she stepped back and disappeared into the house. Cosimo waited. The cold bit at his fingers, the wind whipped his face, but he did not move. A few minutes later, Agnese appeared at the door. She studied him with those amber eyes that seemed to see through all masks. Then, without a word, she stepped aside to let him enter. The interior of the house was warmer this time, the fire crackling in the improvised fireplace. Beppe Moretti occupied the same chair by the window, but now there was a mug of something hot between his wrinkled hands. Cosimo crossed the room, but this time he stopped before the old man. "Signor Moretti." His voice sounded strange to his own ears, humble almost. "I am Cosimo Frescobaldi. I apologize for my rudeness on my last visit. It was unforgivable." The silence that followed was long. Then, slowly, a smile spread across Beppe's aged lips. "I know your father, you know." Beppe spoke, looking at some point beyond the walls, as blind men who see with memory do. The old Marquis, a hard man but fair in his own way. "He came to my vineyards many times when I could still see." "Did you work on my family's lands?" "I worked on my own lands, which happened to be within your family's lands." There was a dry laugh in the correction. "I was a master vintner for 40 years. I developed a pruning technique that almost doubled the yield. Your father recognized the value of that." Cosimo felt something tighten in his chest. How many people like Beppe Moretti lived on his lands? How many stories, how many skills, how many lives had he ignored simply by deeming them beneath his attention? He spent an hour there, talking with the old man about wines and harvests, about fermentation techniques and the secrets of the Tuscan terroir. When he finally rose to leave, his eyes met Agnese's for the first time since he had arrived. She watched him with an expression he couldn't decipher, something between surprise and caution, like one seeing a wolf behave like a lamb, and unsure whether to trust it. "May I speak with you, signorina?" He indicated the door with a discreet gesture. "In private." Agnese hesitated. Then she nodded and followed him out to the small, snow-covered yard. The cold air wrapped around them like a cloak. Cosimo took a deep breath before speaking. "I have come to renew my proposal." The amber eyes narrowed, but she didn't throw water this time. She just waited. 8,000 lire, land for your family, a decent house within the castle grounds where your father and sister can live comfortably. He paused. "I know I offended you last time. I know I acted like an arrogant fool who only sees his own reflection, but I am asking for a second chance. Why should I trust you?" It was a fair question. Cosimo didn't have a good answer, so he offered the only one he possessed, the truth. "You shouldn't. I haven't given you reason to trust me, but I am willing to accept your conditions, whatever they may be." Agnese studied him for a long moment. The snow fell softly around them, landing on their hair, melting on their cheeks like cold tears. "3 conditions," she finally said. 3, and no less. Cosimo nodded. "First, I will be treated as countess before everyone without exception. No one will ever call me a peasant, a washerwoman, or anything other than my name or my title, not for self-pride, but for the dignity of my father, who did not raise a daughter to be humiliated. I accept. Second, my family will live in a respectable house on the castle grounds. My father will have a servant to assist him, and my sister will have access to books and education. They will be treated as my family, not as dependents or hangers-on. I accept. Third, she lifted her chin and there was steel in her voice. You will never touch me without my consent. Never. This marriage may be one of appearances, but my body is mine, and it will remain mine until the day I decide otherwise. Cosimo felt the weight of those words. It was a condition that in any other context would be considered absurd. A wife refusing the marital bed was grounds for scandal, perhaps even annulment. But Agnese was not asking, she was demanding, and he, for reasons he didn't yet fully understand, respected her even more for it. I accept. They faced each other in the falling snow, two strangers about to unite their lives by a contract of convenience. But there was something there, a spark perhaps, or just the reflection of the winter sun, that suggested this agreement was more than it seemed. Then we have a deal, Agnese said. But remember, Lord Count, I keep my word, and I expect you to keep yours. Cosimo extended his hand, not to seal the deal, but to offer it as equal offers to equal. Agnese looked at the outstretched hand for a moment. Then, slowly, she took it. The grip was firm and cold, and it carried the promise of something neither of them could name. Part 3. The Vows and the Silence. January 1847. The chapel of Castello Frescobaldi had not seen a wedding ceremony in over 30 years, not since the nuptials of Marquess Leopoldo himself with the woman who would become Cosimo's mother. The stone walls held the winter cold like an ancient secret, and the colored stained glass filtered the pale January light into beams of red, blue, and gold that fell upon the altar like silent blessings. The servants had worked for days to prepare the space. Candles burned in iron candelabra, winter flowers, cyclamen and Christmas roses, decorated the wooden pews, and a red carpet covered the central aisle, hiding the centuries-worn stones. But despite all the effort, the chapel remained almost empty. On the groom's side, only the lawyer Signor Bianchi and the butler Bernardo. On the bride's side, Beppe Moretti seated in a chair specially brought for him, Giulia holding his hand, and Father Anselmo, who had traveled from Santa Margherita to officiate the ceremony, refusing any other priest. The servants whispered in the corners, exchanging meaningful glances. A peasant marrying the count, the washerwoman becoming the lady of the castle. It was scandal enough to fuel conversations for generations. Cosimo waited by the altar, dressed in an impeccable dark suit, his hair combed back, his expression illegible. His hands, usually so steady, betrayed a slight tremor that he struggled to hide. When the chapel doors opened, all those present turned to look, and what they saw left them silent. Heineke's walked down the aisle alone. There was no father to lead her, as Beppe could not see the way, and she had refused any substitute. She wore a dress she had sewn herself, simple but elegant white linen fabric with delicate embroidery on the sleeves and hem that she had worked on for nights on end. She had refused the silks and laces Cosimo offered. She had refused the jewels, the imported veils, the kid leather shoes. She came as she was, as she had always been. And there was more beauty in that simplicity than in all the gold of Tuscany. Her hair was loose, falling in waves over her shoulders, adorned only by a sprig of rosemary, the herb of memory, the herb of fidelity. Her feet wore the shoes she used for Sunday Mass, and her amber eyes stared straight ahead, unwavering, unfaltering. Cosimo felt something strange in his chest as he watched her approach. It was not love. It was too early for that, and he doubted his own capacity to love. But it was something. Respect, perhaps, or admiration, or simply the recognition that this woman was, in all the ways that mattered, nobler than he would ever be. Father Anselmo conducted the ceremony with ancient words, in Latin, that echoed through the stone walls like long-forgotten prayers. When the moment for the vows arrived, his voice softened. Cosimo Alessandro Frescobaldi, do you take Agnese Maria Moretti as your lawful wife, to love and respect her, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do. Agnese Maria Moretti, do you take Cosimo Alessandro Frescobaldi as your lawful husband, to love and respect him, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? A silence. Too long. The servants exchanged glances. Giulia squeezed her father's hand. Cosimo felt his heart stop for an instant. Then Agnese spoke, and her voice was clear as spring water. I do. The rings were exchanged. Simple gold bands, without ornaments or inscriptions. When Cosimo's fingers touched Agnese's to slide the ring onto her hand, he noticed they were cold, but firm, always firm. I now pronounce you husband and wife. Father Anselmo's voice echoed through the chapel. You may kiss the bride. The moment stretched like a rope about to break. Cosimo looked at Agnese and she returned his gaze. There was no invitation there, but there was also no refusal, only waiting. He leaned in. His lips touched hers for a fraction of a second. Brief, chaste, the minimum that convention required. Agnese did not recoil, but she also did not respond. It was like kissing marble. Beautiful, cold, impenetrable. It was done. They were husband and wife. The ensuing banquet was modest, by Agnese's choice, who refused the excesses Cosimo had proposed. There was wine from her father's vineyards, bread baked that morning, local cheeses, olives, and dried fruit. The few guests ate in respectful silence, and when the sun began to set, each retired to their quarters. The wedding night arrived as a storm approaches on the horizon, inevitable, laden with possibilities. Cosimo escorted Agnese to the rooms that had been prepared for her, a spacious chamber in the east wing of the castle, with a four-poster bed and damask curtains, a fireplace crackling against the cold, a full-length mirror that reflected the candlelight. At the door he stopped. I will give orders that no one is to disturb you. His voice was careful, measured. I will spend the night in the library. If you need anything, just ask the servants. Agnese studied him for a moment. There was something in her eyes he couldn't decipher, surprise perhaps, or relief, or something more complex that escaped words. You are keeping your word. I am trying. She nodded, an almost imperceptible movement. Then, without another word, she entered the room and closed the door. Cosimo remained there for a long moment, staring at the dark wood that now separated them. He could have entered. He could have demanded his rights as a husband. The law would be on his side. Society would support him. No one would condemn him. But he had given his word. And for the first time in his life, Cosimo Frescobaldi discovered that his word meant something. He walked to the library as promised. He chose a volume at random, Petrarch, the love sonnets he would never fully understand, and sat in an armchair by the fireplace. Outside, the snow continued to fall on Tuscany, covering the world in white. And inside the castle, in chambers separated by corridors and silences, a man and a woman began a journey neither of them could foresee. The first weeks of marriage passed like blank pages, together in the same book, but with no words to connect them. They crossed paths in the corridors, ate meals at the same table, slept under the same roof, but they did not talk, they did not touch. They shared nothing but space and silence. The servants watched, waiting for explosions, for drama, for something to justify the bets they still made in secret. But what they saw was merely two strangers cohabiting with the cold politeness of diplomats in neutral territory. Agnese spent her days exploring the castle, its endless corridors, its dusty rooms, its abandoned gardens. Cosimo spent his days locked in the study, pretending to work on papers he didn't understand, waiting for time to pass and the will to be fulfilled. And so January gave way to February, and the ice of winter began very slowly to show the first signs of thaw. But the true thaw was yet to come. Part 4. The Thaw, February 1847. The change began so subtly that no one noticed at first. Neither the servants nor Cosimo, perhaps not even Agnese herself, who acted more by instinct than by plan. It began with a visit to the kitchen. It was a cold February morning when Agnese descended the stone stairs leading to the castle's bowels, territory no lady would deign to step foot on. The cook, a stout woman named Marta, who had commanded the stoves for 3 decades, almost dropped a pot upon seeing her enter. "Lady Countess," Marta's voice was shrill with shock, "you shouldn't be here." Agnese ignored the comment. She walked among the workbenches, observing the pots, the ingredients, the frightened faces of the kitchen assistants who stopped their tasks to stare at her. "What is your name?" She pointed to a boy no older than 12 who was peeling potatoes in a corner. "Pietro, signora." "And yours?" To a middle-aged woman kneading bread. "Rosa, signora." One by one, Agnese learned their names, all of them, and not just the names, their stories. Pietro was an orphan, raised in the castle since babyhood. Rosa had 5 children and a husband who worked in the stables. Old Tommaso, who tended the fireplaces, had been a soldier in the Napoleonic Wars and had a scar on his arm he liked to show to anyone who asked. That same afternoon, Agnese summoned Bernardo. "The servants are not eating properly." It was not a question, it was a statement. The butler hesitated. It was true. For years the rations had been reduced, first by the Marquess, who considered spending on servants a waste, then by inertia. "The pantries are managed according to the former Lord's instructions, Countess." "Well, now they will be managed according to my instructions." Agnese's voice brooked no discussion. "Starting tomorrow, every servant will receive 3 proper meals a day, meat twice a week, fresh bread every morning, and in winter, hot wine to warm them." Bernardo opened his mouth to protest. It was a breach of protocol, an unnecessary expense, something the Count would surely disapprove of. But Agnese's gaze silenced him. "It will be done, Countess." And it was done. In the days that followed, Agnese continued her silent revolution. She reorganized the pantries to reduce waste. She discovered that entire rooms in the castle had been closed for years, furniture rotting under dusty sheets, tapestries being devoured by moths. She ordered windows to be opened, rugs to be shaken out, air and light to be let in, where only shadows had reigned for so long. The servants, initially distrustful, began to change. They no longer lowered their eyes when she passed. They looked at her directly. Some even smiled. Small gestures of recognition, of gratitude, of something that could, in time, become loyalty. Cosimo observed from afar. He saw how the staff worked harder when Agnese was around. He saw how the cook prepared more elaborate dishes without being asked. He saw how the castle, which had always seemed cold and hostile to him, was beginning to gain a kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplaces, and this irritated him. Not the change itself. He was not so petty as to resent the servants eating better. What irritated him was the contrast. In 31 years, he had never managed to inspire anything but fearful obedience. This woman, in just a few weeks, had won something he didn't even know how to name. One night, unable to sleep, Cosimo went down to the kitchen in search of a bite to eat. He found Agnese sitting by the nearly extinguished fire, a cup of tea in her hands, her eyes lost in the embers. She showed no surprise at seeing him. She merely indicated a chair beside her with her head. Cosimo hesitated. Then he sat down. They remained in silence for a long moment, 2 strangers warming themselves by the same fire. When Agnese finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost thoughtful. "Do you know what I learned washing clothes for so many years, Lord Count?" He didn't answer, just waited. "I learned that the hardest dirt to remove is not the one you see. It's the one that accumulates in the fibers, invisible, corroding the fabric from within." She took a sip of tea. "This castle is dirty like that, not with dust or mold, but with years of negligence, of people who were treated as things, of lives that were ignored." Cosimo swallowed hard. He knew she wasn't just talking about the servants. "And you intend to clean all that up?" Agnese finally looked at him. Her amber eyes glittered in the light of the embers. "I intend to try." A pause. "And you, sir, what do you intend to do while you are here?" It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of a challenge. Cosimo didn't have an answer. He never had. He had always lived reacting to his father's orders, to society's expectations, to the whims of the moment. He had never stopped to ask himself what he wanted to do. That night, Lying in his room as the snow fell silently over Tuscany, Cosimo thought about Agnese's question. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something beyond the usual emptiness. He felt ashamed that he didn't have an answer, and perhaps the first flicker of desire to find one. March 1847. The invitation arrived in an ivory paper envelope, sealed with red wax and delivered by a messenger who had ridden from Florence without stopping. The Duke Corsini requested the honor of the presence of Count Frescobaldi and his wife at a ball in his palace, an event that would gather the cream of the Tuscan nobility. Cosimo knew upon reading the invitation that it was not courtesy. It was a test. Rumors of his marriage to a peasant had spread like fire in dry straw, and high society was curious to see the anomaly up close. To refuse would be to admit shame. To accept would be to expose Agnese to the cruelty of that world. He found her in the winter garden, the only space in the castle she had managed to revive completely. Potted plants, flowers that defied the cold, a smell of damp earth and life that contrasted with the sterility of the rest. "We must go to Florence." He handed her the invitation. Agnese read it in silence. When she finished, her face betrayed nothing. No fear, no anxiety, no anger. "When?" "In 2 weeks." She returned the invitation with a calm gesture. "Then I need a dress." The journey to Florence took a whole day. Agnese spent most of the journey in silence, watching the landscape through the carriage window, the fields that were beginning to awaken with the arrival of spring, the stone villages clinging to the hills, the cypress trees that stood like sentinels along the roads. Cosimo tried a few times to initiate conversation about the ball, about what to expect, about how to behave before the nobility. Agnese listened patiently, nodding at the right moments, but her answers were monosyllabic. He didn't know if it was indifference or just concentration. The Corsini Palace rose on the banks of the Arno like a monument to excess. Facades of pale stone, windows illuminated by thousands of candles, carriages queuing to unload their passengers adorned with jewels and silk. Agnese wore a borrowed dress, an old piece that had belonged to Cosimo's mother, hastily altered to fit her slender body. It was beautiful, a deep blue that highlighted her amber eyes, but clearly out of fashion. The fabrics were not of the season. The cut did not follow the latest Paris trends. She seemed to know it, and did not seem to care. The ballroom was a sea of colors, sounds, and perfumes that stunned the senses. Women in gowns that cost more than the Moretti house danced with men in military uniforms or embroidered coats. Crystal chandeliers poured light over everything, transforming the environment into something bordering on the unreal. When Cosimo and Agnese entered, a momentary silence fell over the nearest attendees. Glances turned in their direction, some curious, others openly hostile. Then, like a wave, the whispers began. "Is that her? The peasant? I heard she used to wash clothes. What a dreadful dress." Agnese kept her head held high. She walked beside Cosimo as if she were a queen entering her own palace, showing no sign of hearing the gossip, not flinching at the stares. Cosimo felt something tighten in his chest. Pride? No, it was something more. Admiration, perhaps, or shame of himself for having feared for her. The first hour passed in relative calm. They circulated the hall, greeting Cosimo's acquaintances with polite nods, avoiding longer conversations. Agnese sampled small portions of the canapes, observed the dancers with a neutral expression, replied with monosyllables when someone addressed her. Then came Countess Strozzi. Eleonora Strozzi was everything Agnese was not. Tall, blonde, dressed in French silk that cost a fortune, adorned with diamonds that sparkled like captured stars. She approached the couple with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of smile that precedes a blow. "Count Frescobaldi!" Her voice was sharp, projected to be heard by everyone around. "What a surprise to see you here! And this must be your wife." The pause before the last word was deliberate, laden with contempt. "Countess Agnese Frescobaldi." Agnese extended her hand with the grace she had spent weeks practicing in front of the mirror. "A pleasure to meet you." Eleonora Strozzi ignored the outstretched hand. Her gaze swept over Agnese's dress from top to bottom, the smile widening into something cruel. "What a charming dress!" The voice dripped venom. "So timeless." She turned to the circle of people that had formed around them, like vultures waiting for carrion. "Did you know the new Countess Frescobaldi used to wash clothes? They say she was the best washerwoman in Santa Margherita." An affected laugh. "Is it true, my dear, that you washed the gentleman's clothes before you washed his honor?" The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Faces turned, eyes gleamed with anticipation. It was the kind of public humiliation that made balls worthwhile, at least for those who were not the victims. Agnese did not reply. Her face remained impassive, but Cosimo saw, because now he knew where to look, the slight tremor in her hands, the way her fingers clenched over the fabric of the dress. And it was then that something broke inside him. Not the cold anger he knew so well, not the calculated indifference he used as armor. Something deeper, something he hadn't felt since he was a child and saw his mother slighted by his father's relatives because of her less noble background. Cosimo stepped forward. The silence around them became absolute. "Countess Strozzi." His voice was soft, but sharp as a honed blade. "My wife is the Countess Frescobaldi. Her past, whatever it may be, is part of what makes her the woman she is. A woman who, in just a few weeks, has earned the respect of everyone who works on our lands, something that generations of Frescobaldis failed to achieve." He extended his hand to Agnese, not a gesture of protection but of partnership. "As for washing clothes, I imagine it is a more honorable profession than many practiced in this hall. At least it is useful." Countess Strozzi paled. The circle around them began to disperse, no one wanting to be associated with the fiasco. Cosimo turned to Agnese, his hand still extended. "Countess, would you grant me the honor of this dance?" Agnese looked at his hand, then at his face, and for the first time since they met, he saw something beyond the masks they both wore. He saw surprise. He saw something that might be gratitude, and perhaps the first glimmer of something more. She accepted his hand. They walked together to the center of the ballroom, under the gaze of hundreds of people. The orchestra, sensing the moment, began a slow waltz, and there, surrounded by enemies and onlookers, the Count and Countess Frescobaldi danced. There were no words. They were not needed. Cosimo guided her firmly but without imposition, and Agnese followed him without submission but with trust. Two bodies learning to move together, two strangers who were beginning very slowly to become something more. When the music ended, the hall erupted in applause, some genuine, others merely to save face. Cosimo and Agnese bowed in reverence, then withdrew from the center. They spent the rest of the evening together. They talked little, but it was no longer a silence of distance. It was the silence of those who do not need words to communicate. In the carriage back home late at night, Agnese finally spoke. "Why did you do that?" Cosimo looked at her in the gloom. The moonlight shone through the curtains, illuminating her profile, her amber eyes that now looked at him with an intensity he hadn't known. "Because it was the right thing to do." "No," she shook her head. "That's not it. You could have remained silent. You could have pretended you didn't hear. No one would blame you." "Why didn't you do that?" Cosimo thought for a long moment. The true answer was too complex for words, so he offered what he could articulate. "Because you didn't deserve that, and because—" He hesitated. "Because I wanted you to know that you are not alone." Agnese did not reply, but in the darkness of the carriage, her hand found his and remained there, light as a rose petal, until they reached the castle. Something had changed that night in Florence. Neither of them could say exactly what, but when they said goodnight at the door of their separate chambers, there was a moment, brief, fleeting, when both hesitated. Then each went to their own silence, but the silence this time was different. It was the silence of something beginning to grow. Part Phi, The Confession, April 1847. April brought spring to Tuscany like an explosion of colors and perfumes. The fields were covered with red poppies. Wisteria cascaded purple clusters over ancient walls, and the air carried the sweet scent of orange blossoms. At Castello Frescobaldi, windows long closed were opened to let in the warm breeze, and even the ancient stones seemed less somber under the golden light of the April sun. Agnese had spent the weeks after the ball in a kind of silent limbo. Cosimo's gesture in Florence unsettled her more than any words could. She was prepared for indifference, for coldness, for the calculated disdain of a man who saw her only as a means to an end. She was not prepared for protection. She was not prepared for kindness, and that frightened her more than any public humiliation. Cosimo, in turn, also avoided encounters. He spent his days riding through the lands he was only now beginning to know, talking to the vineyard workers, learning names and stories that had previously seemed insignificant to him. The nights, however, were too long for sleep. It was on one of those sleepless nights when the full moon poured silver through the castle windows that Cosimo decided to go down to the library. Books had always been his refuge in Rome, silent companions who demanded nothing but attention. Perhaps there, among dusty volumes and forgotten shelves, he would find some peace. The Castello Frescobaldi Library was a spacious room on the ground floor, with tall windows that let in enough light to read during the day, and fireplaces at both ends that kept the room warm, even on the coldest nights. The walls were lined with shelves from floor to ceiling, filled with books that no Frescobaldi had bothered to read in decades. Cosimo pushed the heavy door, expecting to find the usual silence. What he found, however, was a lit candle, and Agnese. She was curled up in an armchair by the unlit fireplace, her feet bare beneath the folds of her nightgown, a book open on her lap. Her hair was loose, falling in waves over her shoulders, and her eyes, those amber eyes he now saw in his dreams, were so absorbed in reading that she didn't notice his entrance. Cosimo stood still on the doorstep, unsure whether to retreat or advance. It was the first time he had seen her like this, stripped of the armor they both wore during the day, vulnerable in her concentration, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with dresses or jewels. "I didn't know you frequented the library." His voice startled her. Agnese looked up, and for a fleeting instant, Cosimo saw something beyond the masks. Surprise, perhaps a flash of fear, then the rapid recovery of composure. "I didn't know there still was a library in this castle." She closed the book carefully. "I thought everything here was just for show." It was a provocation, but there was no malice in it. Cosimo crossed the room and sat in the opposite armchair, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "What are you reading?" Agnese hesitated before showing him the cover. Ovid, The Metamorphoses, stories of transformation. There was something in her voice, not sarcasm, but something softer. It seemed appropriate. Cosimo couldn't suppress a half-smile. "And what do you think of it?" "That the ancient gods were cruel. They transformed people into trees, into birds, into constellations, without asking if that was what they wanted." She traced the spine of the book with her fingers. "But maybe that's how it works. Maybe we can only transform when we have no choice." The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. It was not empty. It was not constrained. It was the silence of two people who were finally beginning to lower their defenses. "How did you learn to read?" Cosimo's question was genuine, without the condescension that had marked their first encounters. Agnese looked at him for a moment, evaluating whether the question deserved a truthful answer. She decided it did. "Father Anselmo." Her voice softened with the memory. "When I was 8, he started teaching me in secret. He said that knowledge should not have an owner, that words belonged not only to the rich and powerful." A sad smile. "My father didn't approve at first. He was afraid it would cause me trouble. But my mother believed that knowing how to read would give me weapons that no one could take away. Your mother was wise. My mother died when I was 8, giving birth to Julia." The words came out simply, without self-pity. "I never knew if she was right. I only know that words are the only thing that truly belongs to me." Cosimo thought of his own mother, the gentle woman who sang him to sleep, who taught him his first letters, who died when he was 10, leaving him alone with a father who didn't know how to love. "Mine also died when I was a child." The words escaped before he could contain them. "Fever. It took 3 days. My father wouldn't let me see her at the end." Agnese offered no words of empty consolation. She simply looked at him with those eyes that seemed to see beyond surfaces. "Is that why you ran away to Rome?" The question was too direct, too sharp. Cosimo should have been offended, should have shut down as he always did when someone came too close. But there was something about that night, perhaps the late hour, perhaps the moonlight, perhaps simply the fatigue of so many masks, that made him answer with the truth. "I ran because I couldn't look at my father without seeing the man who kept me away from her. I ran because the castle reminded me of everything I lost. I ran because—" He hesitated, searching for words he rarely used. "Because it was easier to be a nobody in Rome than to be the son my father despised." "Your father despised you." "My father never hugged me, never told me he loved me, never showed pride in anything I did." Cosimo laughed, a bitter sound. "His will was the closest thing to paternal advice I ever received, and even that was an ultimatum." Agnese was silent for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft. "My father went blind when I was 19, an accident in the fermentation vats. He lost his sight in a matter of hours." She looked at the imaginary flames in the unlit fireplace. "In the first few months he wanted to give up. He said he was useless, that he was a burden. I didn't let him. I argued with him every day until he agreed to live. And he accepted. He accepted to learn, to walk again, to recognize things by touch and smell, to be useful in other ways. Today he can identify a ripe grape just by the aroma. He can tell by the weight of a cluster if the harvest will be good. A genuine smile, the first Cosimo had seen on her. He is the most stubborn man I know, and I am just like him. Cosimo felt something stir in his chest. It was a strange, uncomfortable sensation, like long atrophied muscles being forced to work again. I think I would like to get to know him better. Your father. Agnese raised an eyebrow. You have already met him. Not truly. The first time I ignored him. The second time I was too preoccupied with closing a deal. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. I would like to know him as he deserves to be known. The silence that followed was long, laden with something neither of them could name. Then, very slowly, Agnese nodded. Tomorrow. Her voice was almost a whisper. We can go to the vineyards. My father still knows every inch of that land even without seeing. It was more than an invitation. It was an offer of trust, fragile as newly blown glass. Tomorrow, Cosimo agreed. They remained in the library until dawn began to lighten the horizon. There were no more deep confessions, no more exposed wounds, just conversation about books, about music, about the dreams they had both buried long ago. When they finally separated at the library door, there was something different in the air between them. It was not love, it was too early for that, and both had too many wounds to surrender so easily. But it was the beginning of something. A bridge being built over the chasm that separated them. That morning, for the first time since the wedding, Cosimo slept in peace, and he dreamed of amber eyes. Part 6. The Choosing, May 1847. The spring of May painted Tuscany in deep green. The Frescobaldi estate vineyards, which had slept through the winter cold, now burst into life. New shoots emerging from the ancient vines, tendrils reaching out for support, tiny flowers announcing the promise of the grapes to come. Cosimo rode beside Agnese along the dirt path that led to the house where the Moretti family now lived, a much more respectable stone building than the cottage in Santa Margherita, with a garden where Giulia grew flowers and a porch where Beppe sat every afternoon to feel the sun on his face. The blind old man waited for them, his wooden cane leaning against his chair, his wrinkled hands resting on his knees. Even without seeing, he turned his head in the exact direction from which the horse's hooves came. Decades of intimacy with that land had sharpened his other senses beyond what seemed possible. Good morning, Signor Beppe. Cosimo's voice was different now. Not the cold formality of before, but something closer to genuine respect. Agnese noticed the change. She didn't say anything, but her amber eyes shone with what might be approval. Count. Beppe smiled, a smile that transformed his aged face. I hear you want to learn about wines, if you have the patience to teach. Patience is what I have most of. Come, let's walk among the vines. Giulia offered her father her arm, guiding him through the first steps until he found the familiar rhythm of the terrain. Then it was Cosimo who took over the role, a gesture that made Agnese stop for a moment, watching the two men walk between the rows of grapevines. Beppe knew every meter of that land. Even blind, he knew where the soil was stonier, where the slope changed, where an underground spring maintained moisture even in the driest summers. This vine. He extended his hand and touched a twisted trunk, his fingers tracing the bark like one reading Braille. I planted it with my father 40 years ago. The grape it yields is special, sweeter, more intense. It's because the roots found a vein of limestone down there. How do you know? Because I know this land, Count. I know it as I know my own body. Beppe plucked a new leaf and held it out to Cosimo. Smell. Cosimo obeyed. The aroma was green, fresh, with a hint of something he couldn't identify. Minerals. Beppe smiled again. The earth speaks through the plant. If you know how to listen, it tells you everything. The next few hours were a revelation. Cosimo learned about pruning, the art of cutting to encourage growth, of sacrificing branches to strengthen others. He learned about the technique Beppe had developed decades earlier, a method of tying that allowed the vines to receive more sun without overburdening the trunks. He learned about fermentation, about vats, about the exact moment to harvest each variety of grape. But more than techniques, he learned something about himself. Those lands, the vineyards, the olive groves, the fields that stretched as far as the eye could see, were the source of everything he possessed. Generations of Frescobaldis had built their wealth on the labor of people like Beppe Moretti, and none of them had ever bothered to learn what those workers knew. It was a form of blindness, Cosimo realized, a blindness worse than Beppe's, because it was voluntary. At the end of the afternoon, as the sun began to gild the horizon, the four sat on the porch of the house. Julia served wine, the best the family owned, saved for special occasions, and for a moment there was no difference between count and peasant, between lady and maid. There were only people sharing a moment of peace. "My daughter speaks highly of you." Beppe's voice broke the comfortable silence. He was addressing Cosimo, his opaque eyes turned in the general direction of where the Count was sitting. "She says you are changing. I am trying. Trying is more than most people do." The old man took a sip of wine, savoring it like one savoring a memory. "You know, Count, when I lost my sight, I thought I had lost everything. I couldn't work anymore. I couldn't provide for my daughters anymore. I couldn't be useful anymore." A pause. "I was wrong." "How so?" "I learned that there are many ways to see, and many ways to be useful." Beppe inclined his head toward Agnese. "My eldest daughter has eyes that see what others do not. She saw something in you, Count. Otherwise, she would not have accepted your proposal." Cosimo looked at Agnese. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, her cheeks slightly flushed. From the wine or the conversation, he couldn't tell. "What did she see?" Beppe smiled, the wise smile of one who has lived long enough to understand the complexities of the human heart. "That is something you will have to ask her, when both of you are ready for the answer." The walk back to the castle was silent, but not with the constrained silence of the first few months. It was the silence of those who do not need words to communicate. When they dismounted in the castle courtyard, night had already fallen over Tuscany, sprinkled with stars that seemed brighter than Cosimo had ever noticed. "Thank you," he said, holding the reins of Agnese's horse as she dismounted. "For today, for everything." Agnese looked at him for a long moment. There was something different in her eyes, no longer the cautious distrust of their first encounters, but something softer, more vulnerable. "My father likes you." "And you?" The question escaped before Cosimo could contain it. In the next instant he regretted it. It was too direct, too soon, too risky. But Agnese did not back away. She did not close the masks they had both learned to wear so well. "I'm still deciding." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "But I think—" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I think I am starting to see something too." She did not say what. She didn't need to. That night, for the first time, Cosimo and Agnese dined together, not at opposite ends of the long formal table, but side by side in the small drawing room, with simple dishes and wine from Beppe's vineyards. They talked late into the night, about everything and nothing, about dreams and fears, about the past that had shaped them and the future that was still a blank page. And when they finally separated, at the door of their still separate chambers, there was a moment, brief, laden with possibilities, when their hands touched. It was not a handshake, it was not a caress, it was just a touch, light as a butterfly's wing, that lasted for a fraction of a second before each went to their own silence. But in that fraction of a second, something definitively changed, and both knew there was no going back. Part 7. The Unconditional, June 1847. The summer of June arrived hot and dry, turning the days into waves of heat that shimmered over the golden fields of Tuscany. In the vineyards, the grapes swelled under the scorching sun, promising an exceptional harvest. At Castello Frescobaldi, the windows remained open day and night, seeking any breeze to relieve the oppressive heat. It was in this setting of fullness that the news arrived, shattering the peace Cosimo and Agnese had built with such care. Julia was sick. The messenger arrived at the castle before the sun had risen over the horizon. A young village boy, breathless from running, his eyes wide with fear. The fever had struck during the night, he said. The girl was delirious, burning like a cinder, unable to recognize her own father. Agnese heard the words in silence, her face turning into a mask of stone. But Cosimo, who now knew her well enough to read beyond the surfaces, saw the terror in her eyes, the same terror of one who has already lost too much and cannot bear to lose more. "I must go." Her voice was firm but trembling at the edges. "I must care for her." "You will not." Cosimo's words stopped her abruptly. She turned to him, her amber eyes flashing with something bordering on fury. "She is my sister. Exactly why you won't go." He approached her, taking her hands before she could pull them away. "If you go there, you might be infected too. And if you fall ill—" He didn't complete the sentence. He didn't need to. "Then what do you suggest I do? Stay here waiting while my sister may be dying?" "I suggest you let me help." Cosimo ordered his fastest horse saddled that very hour. He rode to Florence in record time, ignoring the heat, ignoring the exhaustion, ignoring everything but the urgency that drove him. In the city, he went straight to the Grand Duke's palace, where his name still carried enough weight to open doors. The Grand Duke's personal physician, Dr. Bianchi, known as the best in all of Tuscany, agreed to accompany him for a considerable sum. They arrived at the Moretti house as the sun was setting, staining the sky red and orange. Giulia was worse. The fever had risen throughout the day, and now she lay in bed like a rag doll, her hair soaked with sweat, her cracked lips murmuring nonsense. Beppe sat beside his daughter, his hands holding hers, his blind eyes shedding tears that streamed down his aged face. Dr. Bianchi worked for hours. Cold compresses, medicinal herbs, tinctures imported from distant places. Agnese assisted at every step, following instructions with military precision, her eyes dry as one who cannot afford the luxury of collapsing. Cosimo remained on the porch, unable to stand still, unable to leave. Every groan that escaped the room was like a knife in his chest. Not just for the girl he barely knew, but for Agnese, for Beppe, for this family that unknowingly had become important to him in a way he couldn't explain. The first night passed with no improvement. The second too. On the third, when the sun rose over a Tuscany exhausted by heat and fear, Cosimo sat on the porch steps and did something he hadn't done since his mother's death. He prayed. He didn't know who he was praying to, or if anyone heard him. But the words came out anyway. Fragments of childhood prayers, desperate promises, silent pleas that this 16-year-old girl would not be taken too. It was there that Agnese found him. She emerged from the house when the sun was already high, her eyes ringed with dark shadows, her face pale with exhaustion. But there was something in her expression that hadn't been there before, something that made Cosimo's heart stop for an instant. The fever has broken. The words fell between them like rain after a drought. Cosimo sprang to his feet, searching her eyes for confirmation that he hadn't misheard. Will she be all right? The doctor says yes. He says the worst is over. Agnese's voice broke, the first cracks appearing in her armor. She will be all right. And then, for the first time since they met, Agnese Moretti wept. They were not silent or discreet tears. They were sobs that shook her entire body, weeks of tension and fear finally finding escape. She did not try to hide. She did not try to pull away. She just stood there, on the steps of that porch, letting the tears come. Cosimo did not think. He did not calculate. He acted only on instinct, wrapping her in his arms as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She did not resist. For the first time, there were no masks between them, no agreements or conditions. There were just two human beings supporting each other in a moment of absolute vulnerability. They stayed like that for a long time. How long, neither could say. When Agnese finally pulled away, her amber eyes were red, her cheeks stained with tears, but there was something different in them, something that later Cosimo would recognize as the moment everything changed. You stayed. Her voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. 3 days, 3 nights. You stayed. Where else would I be? The question was simple, but the answer was anything but. Agnese studied him for a moment, as if seeing him for the first time. Oh, you could have sent the doctor and left. You could have waited for news at the castle. No one would blame you. She paused. Why did you stay? Cosimo thought of all the answers he could give. Safe answers, diplomatic answers, answers that would keep the walls they had both built intact. He chose the truth. Because you matter to me. The words came out more easily than he expected. Your family matters, and I couldn't stay away knowing you were suffering. Agnese did not reply. She didn't need to. That night, when Giulia slept a peaceful sleep of recovery, and Beppe finally rested after days of vigil, Cosimo and Agnese sat together on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one in the Tuscan sky. There were no words. There were no declarations. But when Agnese's hand found Cosimo's in the darkness and remained there, warm, safe, real, both knew they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The marriage of convenience was transforming into something much more, and for the first time, neither of them wanted to stop it. July 1847. July brought with it the peak of the Tuscan summer, and with it, a truth Cosimo could no longer ignore. The will's deadline was approaching. In less than 2 months, the lawyer would come to verify the fulfillment of the conditions. In less than 2 months, the contract that had united Cosimo and Agnese would reach its point of decision. And Cosimo no longer knew what he wanted to happen. The days after Giulia's recovery had been different. There were no dramatic declarations, no sudden changes, but there was something in the air between them, a lightness, a silent intimacy that manifested in small gestures, glances that lasted a second too long, hands that touched when passing a book or a cup of tea, smiles that appeared for no apparent reason. The servants noticed. Bernardo, discreetly, had stopped preparing the library room for the Count. Although Cosimo still slept there, the suggestion was clear. Marta, in the kitchen, began preparing Agnese's favorite dishes without being asked. Even old Tommaso, the gardener who barely spoke, was seen smiling as he watched the couple walk through the gardens. But the contract still existed, and with it, the shadow of a question neither of them dared to ask. It was on a July afternoon when the heat was so intense that even the cicadas seemed silent, that Cosimo made a decision. He found Agnese in the library, her usual refuge, and held out his hand. "Come with me. There is a place I want to show you." They rode along paths Agnese didn't know, moving away from the castle and the familiar vineyards. The landscape gradually changed. Cultivated fields gave way to wilder slopes, covered with ancient olive trees whose twisted trunks bore witness to centuries of existence. The olive grove where Cosimo finally stopped was different from the others, smaller, more intimate, surrounded by a low stone wall worn away by time. In the center, beneath the shade of the largest olive tree, stood a white marble tombstone. Isabella Maria Frescobaldi. Agnese read the words carved into the stone. "Beloved wife and mother, 1805-1836. My mother." Cosimo's voice was soft, almost fragile. This was her favorite place. She used to say that olive trees were like grandmothers, old, wise, patient, that they would give shade and fruit long after all of us were forgotten. Agnese looked around, seeing the place with new eyes. There were wild flowers growing among the tree roots, birds singing in the branches, a peace that seemed to exist outside of time. "It is beautiful. I haven't been here since I was a child." Cosimo sat on the grass, his back leaning against the trunk of an olive tree, his eyes fixed on the tombstone. "After she died, my father forbade me to come. He said that looking back was weakness." Agnese sat beside him, maintaining a respectful distance. She said nothing. She just waited, offering silence as a gift. "I brought you here because—" Cosimo hesitated, searching for words for feelings he barely understood. "Because I wanted you to know this part of me, the part I hid for so many years, the part that is still capable of feeling something besides anger and indifference." "Why now?" "Because the deadline is ending." He finally looked at her, his dark eyes meeting hers. "In less than 2 months, the lawyer will come, the contract will be fulfilled, and then—" He didn't finish. And then you will be free. You will have the money, the land, everything I promised. You can leave, start a new life, forget that all this happened." Agnese remained silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but there was something trembling beneath the surface. "Is that what you want? For me to leave?" Cosimo closed his eyes. The question was simple, but the answer required an honesty he was not accustomed to offering. "No." The word came out like a confession. "No, it is not what I want." "Then what do you want?" He opened his eyes. He looked at her, at that woman who had entered his life as part of a business arrangement and had become, without either of them planning it, the most important person in his existence. "I want you," the words now poured out, impossible to hold back. "Not the countess I bought, not the partner in a contract of convenience, you Agnese, the woman who reads Dante at the fountain, the woman who threw water in my face when I deserved it, the woman who loves her father and sister more than life itself." He paused, swallowing the lump that had formed in his throat. "You, Agnese, if you still want me, if you can still want me." The silence that followed was the longest of their lives. The wind blew softly through the olive trees, shadows danced on the ground. The world continued its course, indifferent to the drama unfolding beneath that ancient tree. Then, slowly, Agnese extended her hand. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her fingers found Cosimo's, intertwining with the certainty of one who finally finds what they were seeking. They stayed like that for a long time, holding hands under the olive tree where Isabella Frescobaldi rested. Two imperfect, wounded, transformed human beings, finding, in the most unlikely of places, something that looked very much like love. When they finally rose to leave, the sun was already setting on the horizon, painting the sky with colors no artist could reproduce. Cosimo stopped before his mother's tomb, still holding Agnese's hand. "Mother," he said softly, This is Agnese. I think you would have liked her. Agnese squeezed his hand tightly, and in that simple gesture, there was a promise that words could not express. The ride back to the castle was silent, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of those who do not need words to understand each other. That night, for the first time, Cosimo did not sleep in the library, and when the sun rose over Tuscany the next morning, illuminating two bodies intertwined beneath white sheets, something that had begun as a farce finally became truth. The will's deadline was still approaching, but now, for the first time, that no longer seemed to matter. Party 8. The Renewal. August 1847. The study was bathed in the golden light of the afternoon when the lawyer Signor Bianchi sat down at the desk, the same yellowed papers from a year ago spread across the oak top. On the other side, Cosimo and Agnese waited side by side, no longer as strangers united by a contract, but as the couple they had become. Bianchi cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles on his pointed nose. Count Frescobaldi, Countess Frescobaldi. His gaze alternated between the two, clearly trying to decipher the dynamic he sensed but did not understand. I am here, as determined by the will of Marquis Leopoldo, to verify the fulfillment of the established conditions. I know why you are here, Signor Bianchi. Cosimo's voice was calm, almost serene. But before you proceed, there is something I must do. The lawyer frowned. Count. Cosimo stood up. With deliberate movements, he walked to the unlit fireplace, where a document rested on the cold stone, the marriage contract he and Agnese had signed months earlier. 8,000 lire, land, a house for the Moretti family, 2 years of appearances. He picked up the document. He looked at Agnese, who watched him with those amber eyes he now knew so well, every nuance, every shadow, every light. And he tore the contract in half. The sound of the paper tearing echoed through the study like thunder in a clear sky. Signor Bianchi jumped up, his face pale with shock. Count, what are you doing? I am setting myself free. Cosimo tore the pieces again, turning the document into fragments that fluttered to the floor like dead leaves. This contract represented a farce, a business agreement disguised as a marriage, and that is exactly what my father wanted me to avoid. The lawyer stammered, lost between protocols and incomprehension. Cosimo turned to him, his expression more open than it had ever been. My father left that will because he knew me better than I knew myself. He knew I would be capable of turning even a marriage into a cold business deal. He knew I needed someone to challenge me, to transform me. He looked at Agnese. I found that person. Not because of the contract, despite it, but the conditions. Bianchi still tried to process what was happening. The marriage remains valid. Only the contract has been destroyed. Cosimo sat down again, this time taking Agnese's hand. I want to renew my vows, not before lawyers and clauses, but before God and the people who matter. I want my marriage to be real, Signor Bianchi, finally real. Signor Bianchi looked from one to the other, searching for signs of madness or manipulation. What he saw, however, was something much simpler and much rarer. Two people who had found in each other something they didn't know they were looking for. The will, he began, still hesitant. The will has been fulfilled to the letter. Cosimo smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his austere face. I am married. My wife resides in the castle. The conditions have been met. But the spirit of the will, what my father truly wanted, is only now being honored. Signor Bianchi remained silent for a long moment. Then, very slowly, he put the papers back in his leather brief. I will inform the registry that the conditions have been met. His voice was professional, but there was something in his eyes, respect perhaps, or simply relief. The Frescobaldi family assets officially pass into your full possession, Count. Thank you. The lawyer rose, offered a formal bow, and left the study. When the door closed behind him, the silence that remained was heavy with meaning. Agnese looked at the pieces of paper scattered on the floor, the remnants of the contract that had once defined their relationship. Then she looked at Cosimo. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. He held both her hands in his. I did because you deserve more than an agreement. You deserve a real husband. You deserve real love. A pause. And I want to be able to offer that. You already do. Agnese's words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had lived through together. The silent battles, the shared vulnerabilities, the slow and painful transformation of two strangers into something much more. Cosimo pulled her to him, embracing her in a hug that was neither formal nor convenient. It was the hug of a man who had finally learned to open his heart. I want to renew our vows, he whispered into her hair. in the little church of Santa Margherita, where your father Anselmo can bless us, with your family present, with the servants who wish to come. I want the world to see that I chose you, not because of a will, not because of a deadline, not because of conditions. I chose you because you are the most extraordinary person I have ever met. Agnese pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. There were tears in hers, not of sadness, but of something much more luminous. And I chose you. Her voice trembled at the edges. Not the arrogant count who walked into my kitchen without greeting my father. Not the cold man who offered money for a wife. I chose the man who danced with me in Florence when everyone was laughing. The man who spent sleepless nights caring for my sister. The man who took me to his mother's tomb to show me who he truly is. They kissed there, in that office that had witnessed so many cold and calculated business deals. But this kiss was not about business. It was celebration, promise, the beginning of something new. When they finally separated, Cosimo had a smile on his face that Bernardo, peeking through the crack in the door, swore he had never seen in all his years of service. "We need to plan a ceremony," Cosimo said. "We do," Agnese agreed. "But first, there is something I want to do." "What?" She knelt by the fragments of the contract scattered on the floor. One by one, she gathered the pieces of paper, collecting them in her hands as if they were petals of a fallen flower. "I will keep this," she said, standing up. "Not as a reminder of an agreement, but as a reminder of who we were before we met, so that we never forget where we came from and how far we traveled to get here." Cosimo looked at her with a tenderness he didn't know he possessed. "You are remarkable, you know?" Agnese smiled, that rare smile that illuminated her whole face. "I'm just getting started." And she was. They both were. Epilogue: The New Legacy, Spring 1848. The little church of Santa Margherita had never been so full. The wooden pews, worn by generations of worshippers, overflowed with people. Not only the villagers who had known Agnese since birth, but also the castle servants who came down from the hills to witness what everyone already knew to be true. Wildflowers decorated the simple altar, gathered that very morning by Julia and the village children. The scent of spring drifted through the open windows, mingling with the incense and candle wax. Father Anselmo, whose hair had completely whitened in recent years, but whose eyes still shone with the same gentle wisdom, waited before the altar with his hands joined. Beside him, Beppe Moretti occupied a place of honor, not to see the ceremony, but to feel it in every fiber of his being. When Cosimo entered through the side door, dressed in simple clothes he had chosen himself, a murmur ran through the congregation. This was not the distant count they knew from afar, the arrogant heir who rode through his lands without seeing them. This was a different man, transformed, softened, stripped of the armor he had carried for so long. He walked to the altar and waited. Then the main doors opened. Agnese entered to the sound of a solitary violin, one of the castle servants who played in his free time. She wore the same white linen dress from their first wedding, but now there were flowers in her loose hair, a bouquet of rosemary and lavender in her hands, and a smile on her face that she didn't try to hide. Julia walked beside her, scattering petals along the path, her face radiant with joy. The girl who had almost succumbed to fever now overflowed with life, her hair braided with colorful ribbons, her eyes shining with happy tears. When Agnese finally stopped before Cosimo, the world seemed to fall silent. Neither the birds singing outside, nor the discreet crying of some women in the congregation. Only the space between two people who had traveled so far to reach that moment. Father Anselmo began the ceremony with ancient words that sounded new. "We are gathered here to celebrate the union of two souls who found in each other what they sought, not in gilded halls or formal agreements, but in the small truths of daily life, in silent care, in the patience of gestures, in the love that grows slowly, like a grapevine clinging to the earth." He looked at Cosimo. "Cosimo Alessandro Frescobaldi, do you take Agnese Maria Moretti as your life companion, to love and respect her, to grow by her side and learn from her for all the days God grants you?" "I do." Cosimo's voice was clear, without hesitation. "And you, Agnese Maria Moretti, do you take Cosimo Alessandro Frescobaldi as your life companion, to love and respect him, to grow by his side and teach him for all the days God grants you?" "I do." Father Anselmo smiled, the smile of one who sees his greatest hopes confirmed. "Then, by the power vested in me by the Church and by faith, I pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man separate." The kiss that followed was neither chaste nor formal. It was the kiss of two people who loved each other. real, deep, laden with promises that words could not express. The congregation burst into applause. Julia threw flowers over the newlyweds, laughing. Beppe wept silently, tears streaming down his aged face as he smiled. The castle servants clapped enthusiastically, and even Bernardo, the impassive Bernardo, had suspiciously moist eyes. After the ceremony, as the villagers prepared for the celebration that would last until night, Cosimo led Agnese to a corner of the churchyard. There was something he needed to do. "I have a gift for you." From the pocket of his coat, he took out a small, sealed envelope. Agnese opened it carefully, frowning at the contents. Official documents with seals and signatures. "What is this?" "The deeds to your father's vineyards. All 20 hectares he worked for 40 years. Cosimo pointed to a specific paragraph. Officially registered in the name of Beppe Moretti and his heirs, not as a donation from the Frescobaldi family, but as recognition of the work he did, the technique he developed, the value he created. Agnese looked at him, her amber eyes shining with tears. "You didn't have to—" "Yes, I did." He held her face in his hands. "Your father dedicated his life to that land. The pruning technique he created is worth more than I could ever pay. This," he indicated the documents, "is just the beginning of settling the accounts my family has with people like him." She threw herself into his arms, squeezing him tightly, whispering thanks he could barely hear over the sound of his own heart. "And there is one more thing," he said, when they finally separated. He led her by the hand to the olive grove where his mother was buried. The oldest olive tree still offered its generous shade over the marble tombstone, but now there was something different. Beside it, a small sapling had been planted, new leaves of deep green sprouting from the thin trunk. "I planted it yesterday," Cosimo explained, "with my own hands. It is the first thing I have ever cultivated in my life." He looked at the sapling, then at Agnese. "I want it to grow alongside our love. I want it to bear fruit. I want it to be here long after us, to remind the world that the son of the Marquess Frescobaldi finally learned what it means to create something instead of just inheriting." Agnese touched the new leaves of the sapling with her fingertips. They were soft, vulnerable, full of promise. "It is perfect." They stood there for a moment, in silence, honoring old memories and planting the seeds of new ones. Then, hand in hand, they returned to the feast that awaited them. Spring 1849. The cry of the baby echoed through the corridors of Castello Frescobaldi, a sound those ancient walls hadn't heard in over 30 years. Leopoldo Beppe Frescobaldi arrived in the world on an April morning, as the first sunbeams warmed the blooming vineyards. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's delicate nose, small hands that already clenched tightly around the finger of whoever touched them. Cosimo held him now, seated in the rocking chair he had specially made for this moment. The baby slept in his arms, his lips making small, sucking movements, even in sleep, completely oblivious to the tears streaming down his father's face. "I never thought I would be capable of this," he said softly, looking at Agnese, who rested in bed after hours of labor. "I never thought I would feel this." Agnese smiled, her eyes tired but luminous. "You underestimated yourself. You taught me not to do that." Outside, through the open window, came the sounds of the waking estate. Servants working in the gardens that now bloomed all year, the blacksmith's hammer fixing tools for the next harvest, the laughter of Julia, who had come to live at the castle to help with the baby, and now studied with private tutors Cosimo had hired. And more distantly, coming from the vineyards, Beppe's voice instructing a group of young workers on the secrets of pruning, secrets he had guarded for decades and now freely passed on, knowing they would be honored. "I brought something to show you." Bernardo appeared at the door, discreet as always, but with a smile he rarely displayed. In his hands, a bottle of wine with a label, unlike any the estate had ever produced. Cosimo carefully took the bottle, without letting go of the baby. The label was elegant but not ostentatious, the Frescobaldi family coat of arms on one side, and on the other, something new. The name Moretti Frescobaldi intertwined in golden letters. "The first batch," Bernardo explained. "Grapes from Signor Beppe's vineyards, harvested with his technique, fermented according to his instructions. It is the best wine the estate has ever produced." Cosimo looked at Agnese, whose eyes were full of tears again. "It's perfect," she whispered. It was more than perfect. It was a symbol of everything they had built, not inherited, not bought, but created with work, patience, and love. That night, When the house finally fell silent and the baby slept in the cradle beside the bed, Cosimo and Agnese stayed awake, watching the full moon through the window. "Do you remember the first day?" she asked, her voice soft in the darkness. "When you found me at the spring? I remember every detail." He intertwined his fingers with hers. "I remember you were reading Dante. I remember you wouldn't bow. I remember you asked me if I was lost. And you were." "I was." He turned to face her. "I was completely lost. And you found me." "We found each other," she corrected. "Hey, it's different." Cosimo smiled. That smile only she knew, that only she was capable of provoking. "You are right. You always are." They remained silent for a moment, two bodies intertwined beneath the same sheets that had once belonged to Cosimo's mother, in the room that was once hers as well. "Do you know what else I remember from that day?" Agnese whispered. "I remember looking at you and seeing something beyond the arrogant count. I saw a lost man trying to find his way home." A pause. "I think that's why I didn't throw water at you then. You saved it for the second time. You deserved it. The second time." They laughed together, softly, so as not to wake the baby. The laughter of two people who knew each other deeply, who had seen the worst in each other and chosen to stay anyway. From the cradle came a small sigh. Leopoldo Beppe Frescobaldi settled into his sleep, unaware of the legacy he would carry, not just of land and titles, but of something much more valuable, the story of how his parents met, challenged each other, transformed each other, the story of a count who learned to see beyond his name, of a peasant who never let her name define her, of a love that was born from a contract and blossomed into something no contract could contain. Outside, Tuscany slept under the stars, and the vineyards kept their promise of future harvests, and the young olive tree in the cemetery grew beside the ancient one, roots intertwining beneath the earth like the fingers of meeting hands. And somewhere between the past and the future, between what was and what would be, a simple truth remained. True love knows no conditions. It recognizes no classes. It does not bow to wills. True love simply is. And it continues to be. Long after the pages close and the stories end,